Good morning to everybody. Um, in case you're wondering, that's a good start, by the way. In case you're wondering, she woke up this morning feeling great. Yesterday she wasn't, so we both decided that she would not want to greet you all with her illness. Um, but I will tell you, I will miss her warm, encouraging smile from the pews today. So you guys have to pick up the slack. All right. So I'm going to start with a question. Have you ever needed to be re-energized? Right? Um, your car needs a new battery every once in a while. You know, the Braves may need a new starting pitcher to get them, out of the slump. Um, Maybe you need to try a new recipe, right? Maybe you just need a good night's sleep. Or in this heat, you just need to find a nice shady spot with an ice cold Coca-Cola. And maybe it's something like that. It was talked about in Tom's class last week. It was talked in Isaac's class last week. Romans 12:2 says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." You know, if you think about it this way, it's a biblical command, right? So for me, when I go back as an adult and I look at the familiar stories that I was taught as a child, and then I look and I see that there's so much more to those stories, it really energizes me to not only learn more about that, but learn some more after that. So today, I would like to look at a very familiar story, the story of Joseph. And somebody asked me this week when I was talking to him about that, is that the Old Testament Joseph or the New Testament Joseph? And they didn't have the benefit of the bulletin. And it is the Old Testament Joseph, but if you pay a close attention, the New Testament Joseph makes a cameo appearance. So I'm going to mention the familiar things, but I'm going to examine some details that we sometimes flash by. And so I hope to shed some light on three separate topics, and I'm hoping that this will encourage you to go back and read these chapters in Genesis again and become energized. So for a very quick review of Joseph, to refresh your memory, but I'm going on the assumption that you all know the Joseph story. I'm going to go through the Joseph story in a timeline perspective, and then one housekeeping note. When I get to my three topics, Jacob's name changed during the process of this when he was blessed by God and when he was renewed the promise that was given to Abraham, that was given to him. And so I'm going to be spanning the time before and after, and I'm always going to refer to him as Jacob, just to be clear. If anybody has a problem with that, you can take me out back and beat me up later. So the story of Joseph, in a real nutshell, this is one page, big letters of the story of Joseph. Joseph was born to Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, later in Jacob's life. So he had been with Laban. He had married Leah. He married Rachel. They started having children. Rachel was barren for a while, and then she finally had Joseph, and so he became Jacob's favorite. Joseph had 11 brothers, and he had a dream about them serving him one day. He got in a little bit of a dispute because he tattletaled on him one time, but Jacob loved Joseph. He gave him a coat of many colors, and all of this made the 10 brothers very angry and jealous. Benjamin was the youngest of all those, and he was probably not a part of all that. So in the course of managing their flocks, Jacob sent his brothers out to search for pasture for the animals, and they apparently had to go quite a ways, and so Jacob sent Joseph out to check on them. And so as he was getting closer to the brothers said, "Here comes the dreamer," and they plotted to kill him. The oldest was Reuben. He didn't want to kill him, but he secretly plotted to save him and circle back and get him out of the well and take him home. Reuben left, and while he was gone, Judah arranged for Joseph to be sold to some Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. Judah, by the way, is credited with saving Joseph and is ultimately in the lineage of Jesus, which is chronicled in Matthew chapter 1 through Jesus' earthly father, Joseph. Um, Old Testament Joseph was sold to a high-ranking Egyptian official named Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife takes a liking to Joseph and acts inappropriately with him, and then blames Joseph, and Joseph, as a result of that, was thrown into prison. Joseph is a model prisoner. He's put in charge of everybody. He gets promoted, and then he has this interpretation of two of the prisoner's dreams. One is the baker, and one is the cupbearer, and both of the dreams came true, unfortunately for the baker. The cupbearer was restored to his position with Pharaoh, and when the Pharaoh had his famous dream of the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows and the 7 big sheaves and the 7 ugly sheaves of grain, then he was bothered by that, and he wanted somebody to interpret it. The cupbearer says, "Oh, I forgot. I've been remiss. There's a guy over in prison that can interpret a dream." So they got Joseph. He interpreted the dreams that there would be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh said, "Who better to be in charge of this than Joseph himself?" And so he becomes in charge of that. And ultimately, the famine was throughout the land, and his brothers in Canaan ultimately needed food. And so they ironically had to ask Joseph for that. And then after some time of being with them and some trips back and forth, he completely forgives them. And then all the Israelites moved to Egypt. So that's the story that we all remember and know. And it's a great story. There's a lot of details in that, but there's 3 topics that I plan to cover today to hopefully add some insight to the familiar story, just because it's interesting to me from an adult perspective, I guess. So the 3 things are: number 1, why did God want the Israelites to end up in Egypt in the first place? Second, Jacob and the deception around him. There's a lot of that, and it's just interesting to note. I'm going to try to chronicle that for you today because it seems to all be around Jacob. I think we could probably learn from that. And then the third thing that I'll spend some time on is how powerful was Joseph after Pharaoh put him in charge? The Bible tells us, and we'll go through that. So the first question is, why did the Israelites end up in Egypt? Well, it started with Abraham's dying request to the chief of his household. I'm going to be spending most of my time with Joseph beginning in chapter 37 of Genesis, but this one takes place in Genesis 24, verses 1 through 4. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac." Now, we know that his servant went to the town of Nahor. He prayed and ultimately came back with Rebekah. And incidentally, verse 16 says that Rebekah was very beautiful. Now, Isaac and Rebekah had Jacob and Esau. Esau married some local women. In Genesis 26, 34 and 35 says, "When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah." In chapter 27, verse 46, Rebekah wants a better marriage for Jacob after he flees to her brother Laban. Jacob had stolen the birthright from Esau, so Rebekah said, "Go live with my brother because Esau wants to kill you." So he was up there, and so Rebekah says to Isaac, "I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me?" So it's clear to me that the women in Canaan were available and tempting to them. And you can also read later on in chapter 34 about Dinah and the Shechemites to see that when the women and children of Shechem entered Jacob's group because they'd killed all their men, they brought their foreign gods with them, and God wanted to protect him from the local influences. Now, when Jacob is moved on to Bethel, God tells him to get rid of all the foreign gods, and so that seems to be the end of that from a Jacob perspective. Now let's look at a few passages regarding how the Egyptians felt about the Hebrews. In Genesis 43:32, and now this is when the brothers are back for a second visit when they brought Benjamin. They served him by himself and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. Now that, to put that in context, the Egyptians ate by themselves, Joseph ate by himself, and the Hebrews ate by themselves. Why? Because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And after the Israelites settled in Egypt, Genesis 46:32 and 33 says, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, at this time, Joseph had been traveling around Egypt, scouting it out, and that may have been the best piece of land that he wanted. He might have manipulated it in a way that they would say the right things, but they weren't being deceitful. They were definitely shepherds, and so that was the way for them to have some prime real estate. So, to build a pure nation, one focused on gods and not foreign gods, it seems to me that it would be easier to expand in Egypt. So, I mentioned regarding deception. It's just interesting how much deception it is. So, it goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau. In fact, a lot of things go back to Jacob and Esau. So, Jacob deceived Isaac and Esau of the birthright. We all know that. And then Jacob was sent by Rebekah to his brother Laban to hide out after Esau was mad. And he wants to marry Rachel, but Laban deceives him and surprises him with Leah. Now, I don't know how that happened, but it did. And then he marries Rachel. Jacob deceives Laban with the sorting of the sheep and the goats by using some painted almond branches or something. I don't know how that works either, but he got a real nice group of livestock. And then he sensed a little tension, so he says, I'm going to go home. He tells his family to pack up, and we all go. And he doesn't tell Laban. He's taken his 2 daughters and all of his grandchildren, and 11 of the brothers were born during this time. So he's taken all of his grandchildren with him, but he doesn't tell Laban. He's sneaking out. So on that journey, Laban chases him and says, you took something from me. And Rachel had. She had taken one of the family gods, and she deceives her dad once again by telling him that she doesn't have them. So in addition to that, when Joseph is thrown into the well, Reuben didn't want to kill him. He wanted to come back and save him. And so Reuben, being well versed in deception from his father, he was around during a lot of this going on, being the oldest. He attempted to deceive his brothers and to save Joseph, I guess a righteous cause. And then we all know that they made up a story about the wild animal killing Joseph, and they deceived Jacob when they went back with the coat of many colors torn to shreds. It just ran in the family and is all associated with Jacob. And then there's actually more deception than that in these verses. You can read about Judah and Tamar. Ultimately, Joseph seems to put a stop to it by the way that he completely forgives his brothers, which is a super touching part of the story that you just need to see. And just a footnote on the Judah and Tamar story. Here we are, we're talking about Joseph, and all of a sudden that chapter is pinned right in the middle of it, and it's very interesting. Some of the commentators say that it may be a way to contrast the two different approaches of Joseph and the way he handled Potiphar's wife and Judah and the way that he handled Tamar, just to show that there's a better way. So let's talk a little bit about the power that Joseph had in Egypt. So after my class that we had here a few weeks ago, Marvin asked me a great question. He said, what became of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego after the fiery furnace? Is there any additional recorded history of them? And so I said, well, let me go look. So I did some studying and I couldn't find anything. So what is recorded in the book of Daniel is what happened. You know, they graduated from Nebuchadnezzar University and were put in charge of one of the provinces, or each one in charge of a province in certain capacity. Then after the fiery furnace, they were promoted in some form or fashion. But what I did find in my study, I was glad that Marvin asked me the question, because it said something very interesting. It said they were promoted to manage affairs in various provinces where many of the Jewish slaves would be held. God set them up in charge of his people so they could make sure that they weren't dealt with as harshly as they could have been. That's, I think, very telling. It's always good to be one of God's people when it comes to these types of things. And so I believe that the same thing is going on here in Egypt with Joseph. So the Israelites moved to one of the most productive farmlands, I'll just tell you, in the world, and they thrive. In addition to that, this is one thing we don't normally think of, they have power. And so I've always cruised by some of these passages, but I'm going to slow down and take a little bit of a closer look. And I'll be reading a lot of these. It's starting at Genesis chapter 41, beginning in verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And then they called out before him, bow the knee. This sounds eerily familiar to what Haman wanted done to him that he had to do to Mordecai. I don't know if he knew anything about that, but it's just, I guess that was the thing to do. But then Pharaoh set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. He gave him his signet ring. He set him up over all the land of Egypt, and nobody could do anything without Joseph's consent. So they haven't collected any grain yet. So this is what this is all about. So Joseph visited all over Egypt to see what he had to work with and what he had to do. So verse 46 continues. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. All right, so at this point, 7 years are up and they're ready. Now let's see what happens when the famine starts. In verse 53, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph has said, there was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe all over the earth. And after the famine brought the Israelites to Egypt, Genesis 47 tells us how Joseph uses the famine to benefit the Pharaoh. And this is the part that I've kind of never really appreciated before. Now, this is chapter 47, verse 13. Now there was no food in the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So the next year they came back, but they didn't have any money. So Joseph made them pay with their livestock. Now Joseph has all their money and all their livestock. Famine wasn't over. The next year they came back and they didn't have money or livestock to bargain with. So Joseph acquired their land and their freedom. So the famine was over and they started to produce again. And Joseph imposed a 20% tax on everything that they produced. Chapter 47, verses 20 and 21 summarizes this. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. So one writer suggests that the political system in Egypt was a system of government that was somewhat feudalistic. You had various tribes and groups that were all autonomous. And so because of the famine, Egypt became more centralized, extremely rich, and very powerful. And we just read how Joseph turned the screws tighter and tighter each time they returned in order to get complete control. He also implemented one of the first tax systems in history. And my opinion, God sent Joseph to prepare for his people to grow into a strong, pure nation and also to control it. The Israelites that showed up, they were connected to the bright young Joseph, and he would have been 44 years old after the famine. And I believe his job was still busy, super important to Egypt and the Pharaoh, and he was happy to get the help of his family. From what I read, this great period lasted between 100 and 150 years until, guess what? They started worshiping Egyptian idols again. So what do we learn from the Joseph story? A whole lot, right? There's some incredible things to learn from that. From the Joseph story, I cannot help but mentioning his unfailing faith. I mean, after being sold into slavery, he kept his purity and remained loyal to Potiphar. He was loyal to the Pharaoh. He was loyal to his family and certainly to God. And in this story, we see the providence of God all over the place. Now, Joseph remembered the dreams of his future as a teenager, and he must have wondered while he was in prison, how that was all going to work out. But finally it became clear, and he knew it was God's plan, which led to complete forgiveness of his brothers. And complete forgiveness of his brothers is another story. Complete forgiveness is when they came in the first time, he toyed with them a little bit, and they came asking for food. But Joseph knew Romans 8:28 before it was written. And we know that those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. In fact, the Roman verse sounds very similar to what Joseph tells his brother after Jacob died. So Jacob died there, and the brothers were concerned that he was holding off on revenge until Dad died, so he could get his revenge later. And so they sent a messenger. They were meek about it. They were coy about trying to figure out what Joseph's intentions were. And this is what Joseph says to them in Genesis 50:19 and 20. Think of the Romans 8:28 passage. It's very similar. Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So forgiveness is tough. But it helped Joseph to be able to look forward and to move forward. And it's the same with us. Forgiveness can be tough sometimes. but it can become a shackle if it's never forgiven. Now, Jesus also teaches us faith, providence, and forgiveness. We know that Jesus had unfailing faith in God, and he showed us the ultimate act of forgiveness by forgiving those that crucified him. And he told us about the home that we'll have with him. You know, from a providential perspective, we don't have to look back to see it. We get to look forward to being there. Now, if you don't have that hope, you can find it in Christ. Through faith, put him on in baptism, and you will be forgiven of your sins. It's a very beautiful thing. Or if you need to respond in any way, please come while we stand and sing.